The disintegration of decision-making at Stormont. In this programme, we shall hear from both the Secretary of State Karen Bradley and former Labour Sports Minister Kate Hoey. But first, let's turn to our commentators, former Stormont Director of Communications Stephen Grimason and former Commissioner for Public Appointments here, Felicity Huston. Felicity, you have some sort of locus on this because although your son has not competed in the Commonwealth Games, he competed in the Olympics quite recently, and so you know a little bit of what it's like for young sports people to be focusing on a goal in the future and maybe training towards something. Do you think that out there are people preparing with the thought of 2021 in the back of their minds who will tonight be disappointed?
Well, I'm sure that's the case. I mean, those of us who have elite sports people in the family know what it's like. They are driven towards the next big event. I mean, Patrick is now focusing on the Olympics for 2020 in Tokyo. You know, when he finished in Rio, we started saving. It's not going to be cheap to get there. And that's how they work. And the idea that, you know, young people who had an opportunity to take part in a multi-sports event, which is quite an unusual thing for most sportsmen, and to see maybe some of the best young people in the world in their sport there, the young in volunteers and so on, all losing this opportunity, because it really does build them up tremendously and give them a great lift, that sort of event, and then it's just been taken away because, yuck, you don't really matter. It's horrible.
I don't know in archery, what's the opposite of missing the bullseye? What would he call this?
Well, quite. Well, it's a miss, it's called, when you miss the target.
So the opposite of hitting the bullseye,
yes,
I should have said.
It's an X if you hit the middle, and it's a miss. And sometimes you lose your arrow, and the arrows can cost £30 or £40 each. It's a lot of money to lose.
So this is an arrow into a far-flung wood.
Off into a far-flung field. I'm glad to say at Patrick's level it rarely happens.
Now, Stephen Grimason, obviously in another life you were inside Stormont Castle. Have you seen this decision coming for some time, or lack of decision?
I have, and the simple fact is I never really thought it had any chance of passing muster without an executive. The simple reason that it had already been through 2 or 3 processes and value for money was an issue, and I think the original bid came in at about 3.8 million. Now, this is the Commonwealth Youth Games. Compare that, for instance, for twice that, for what the government is paying twice that amount of money for, just over, for the Open Championship next year. That will create about at least £75 million net present value to the economy here that week alone. There'll be 150,000 people at the event. There will be then the repeat business because then Portrush is on the open circuit. And just in terms of the size and scale of the event, it's a behemoth, and nor can you compare, as some have done, this event to, for instance, the Rugby World Cup. These are huge events. Now, I fully understand why people want to have our young people focused on sport, and that's a good idea. But at the end of the day, it comes down to priorities. In the final analysis, DETI actually put an independent assessor in to look at this to see if the bid could be made better, and it still failed. The problem is, without a minister present, and there would have been a growing political pressure, and you could have seen the circumstances under which this could have been supported had a minister given a ministerial direction. But without that, in the current circumstance, with recent court decisions about decisions being taken elsewhere, that judges have said, no, you can't do that, no accounting officer is going to put his foot in those waters.
So to be clear, and there's been a statement issued from the Department for the Economy that says whilst this is a disappointing outcome for the Northern Ireland Commonwealth Youth Games Council, without a clear demonstration of value for money, there is no basis for an accounting officer to offer financial support for the Games unless they were formally directed to do so by their minister. So what you're saying is that if this didn't stack up in, if you like, how many people will be taking hotel rooms in Belfast, if it was a case of, oh, this is good for the image of the place, then you'd require political input of the kind that we can't have at the moment because there's a minister and there doesn't seem to be a lot of flexibility for the officials at the moment.
That's exactly right. And the difficulty here is, in terms of the international impact of this, there wouldn't have been the sort of huge live coverage of all of this as there would be with the stuff around the golf and the rugby and that sort of stuff. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that this is some sort of failed event. It isn't. It's a very good event. It's a great primer, particularly for our athletes, to get them going. But you have to take a view that only a minister could take, which say, yes, it doesn't add up, but it's not the first time we've had ministerial directions to do things. And it's not simply a matter for the DETI minister either. Any decision taken to go on the basis of a ministerial direction then has to be reported to the Department for Finance, and the Finance Minister has to sign off on that as well, because it's a call on the Executive's fund. So it is difficult territory. It's unfortunate, but I never really thought this had much of a chance.
Well, Stephen, Felicity, thanks. I'll turn to you both later in the programme for a bit more comment. At Northern Ireland Questions on Wednesday in the House of Commons, both the DUP's Nigel Dodds and Labour's Kate Hoey urged the Secretary of State Karen Bradley to step in directly, but she batted the problem back to the local parties. Today, after that announcement from the Commonwealth Games Federation taking the Youth Games away from Northern Ireland, my colleague Gareth Gordon asked Karen Bradley why she hadn't intervened.
We've seen the success we've had in Northern Ireland with things like the Giro d'Italia and the police games that we had in the last few years, all of which were secured under devolved government. Now, I hope that we can reach a resolution on the Commonwealth Youth Games, but this is a matter for locally elected politicians. They bid for the games, and it's for them to come together and make this happen.
But this requires ministerial sign-off, we're told, and we don't have any local ministers. The only one we've got is you.
This is exactly the point where we need devolved government. This is why locally elected politicians need to come together and make those decisions, because this is precisely the kind of reason the example that we see of what can happen if we don't have devolved government. We've seen successes in the past of major sporting events coming to Northern Ireland. I want to see that continue.
Are you, in a way, using this as a stick to beat the local politicians with?
This isn't about sticks or anything else. This is just the reality of not having devolved government, not having ministers in place, and what happens. That's why politicians need to come together. That's why I'm encouraging them to start talking and to get back in stormont.
We're told the local parties, with the possible exception of Sinn Féin, have told the head of the civil service that they are in support of the games coming to Northern Ireland, but he clearly feels he's hamstrung because of the recent legal decision over the incinerator.
I don't think that's the point. The point is that there was a business case which came out before the executive collapse, which showed it wasn't value for money. That's the mark that David Stirling has made as to why he doesn't feel he can support the games. But I hope the actions that the leaders of the major parties are taking will help him.
But we believe the deadline is, if not passed, pretty close.
As I say, I hope that the actions they've taken will help, and I encourage them to come together, work together, get back into Stormont and deliver things like the Commonwealth Youth Games.
Well, that was the Secretary of State Karen Bradley speaking to Gareth Gordon on the margins of the British-Irish Council meeting in Guernsey, and I should have said that interview was before the announcement, although clearly she knew which way the land was lying in terms of that. Local boxing stars Carl Frampton and Michael Conlon are amongst the sportsmen and women who cut their teeth at the Commonwealth Youth Games. A short time ago, Michael Conlon expressed his dismay.
It's a very sad day for all the boxers and all the athletes who would have competed from the home nations. As you know, I competed in the Commonwealth Youth Games myself back in 2008, and I felt it was a big catalyst for how I went on and done so well in my own career. It was my first international tournament, and it gave me a great experience for what was ahead of me in the future. Say, you go to competitions all around the world, but it's different when it's the games. And then I went to the Commonwealth Games, and I had that experience also, the senior Commonwealth Games, but the Youth Games kind of set me up for that kind of platform, and how to see other athletes perform and how sport evolved around the games. It was probably stupid bidding for it if they weren't actually going to hold the games. I think it was a bit silly to go for the bid if they weren't going to hold it. It's definitely a missed opportunity for the athletes and for development of some athletes.
Well, that was the boxer Michael Conlon. I've been speaking to Kieran Kearney from the Northern Ireland Sports Forum and asked him if the Secretary of State should have stepped in.
I think obviously the Commonwealth Games Council met with the Secretary of State last week and also officials from the DCMS. She has taken the approach that I suppose that she has across every issue at certain stages. She has said that it's the responsibility of the devolved government. We would have liked something stronger. She did ask us to go back and get political party leaders to write to the head of the civil service. We knew that at a lot of the stages the communication back with the head of the civil service hadn't resolved with any benefit. So at the stage that we were in the last 2 or 3 days, we knew it was going to be very difficult. The MLAs that met with us on Wednesday or Monday night, I think it was, said that we should maybe write to Theresa May. So we decided we would try and go down that angle. We knew it was going to be last ditch. We knew it was going to be difficult, but they were willing to try anything at that stage.
So right now, are you blaming the officials for not showing enough flexibility or the politicians for getting them into this mess in the first place?
The politicians that we've engaged with over the last year or so have been really, really supportive in the absence of an executive. Obviously, that has, the issue there with not having an executive means a minister can't approve. One of the main issues that the Northern Ireland Sports Forum and the Commonwealth Games Council have is that the Department for Economy and Tourism NI have been a closed shop as regards to being able to see the business case, how the bid has been assessed, what the criteria is being used. Has it been just purely on bed nights? Have they taken any aspect of a sporting event into it? The cultural, sport, the community benefit, the volunteerism that will benefit. The programme for government outlines that they want Northern Ireland to be an attractive destination with a good international reputation. I don't think this helps in any way, shape or form. So those aspects have not been considered.
So far as the hopeful young sportsmen and sportswomen are concerned, I mean, the kind of lessons you teach them, I suppose, are teamwork, speed, skill, strength. What kind of a lesson, what kind of an example do you think this has given them?
That if things are tough, you quit. And that's not what we like to do in sport. You get setbacks, you get knockbacks. We've had, throughout this process, we have had knockbacks, but we haven't had feedback. Elite athletes at the ages of 13, 14, 15 who may have been looking at the 2018 game or the 2021 games, probably what would have been a big target for them are probably feeling very low, knowing that would have been a big thing on the pathway of their career to be an elite athlete.
And the games will be going on presumably somewhere else, but the number of competitors from Northern Ireland will be much diminished if they're not actually in Belfast or elsewhere in Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland, I believe, took a team of less than 20 to the Bahamas last year, 2017. In 2021, where Northern Ireland actually have a bit of an input into what sports are selected to compete in the games, we possibly could have had about 100 athletes competing. Now, that would have been absolutely fantastic. We've heard Michael Conlon over the last few days talk about the impact that competing in the 2008 Youth Games has made on his career. Card Frampton the same, people like Kieran McGeehan. These are high-profile athletes who are winning medals, titles on the world stage, and this has been a big part of delivering, them to further glory. Now, there'll be 100 or so athletes who won't have that opportunity to compete in Belfast over 2021.
Well, that was Kieran Kearney from the Northern Ireland Sports Forum. Listening to that with me now is the former Labour Sports Minister, Kate Hoey. Kate, obviously, in your youth, I think you were Northern Ireland's high jump champion, were you not?
Such a long time ago, I don't want to even remember.
But you could put yourself into the shoes of the 80 young athletes who might have had a chance to compete if these games had taken place at home, but won't if they take place away.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible, terrible decision that's been taken by the Permanent Secretary. They talk about value for money. This is from the same department that, this is going to cost £2.5 million. That's what had to be underwritten by that amount. This is the same department that I think, wasted something like £500 million on all the heating and what do you call it?
The renewable heating
scheme, the idea that they were actually judging this value for money shocks me. But also, I think the point that was made earlier, tourism isn't the right department to be looking at something like this. Not Sport NI put up a case of why it should happen. That wasn't considered. The sporting side of it wasn't considered. The grassroots legacy wasn't considered. The reality is the golf is wonderful next year, as has been mentioned, but there's going to be very little off-put to young people. There are not going to be that many extra young people get involved in golf because of that. And what we're doing in mainland Britain at the moment is that every time in London, the mayor brought this in, and when I was involved with Boris Johnson as a sports commissioner, that every time you have an international event, you have to actually tie it in to how that's going to develop sport at the grassroots. This is so sad, and I believe, it's a bit of buck passing between the Permanent Secretary and the Northern Ireland office and Karen. I think she could have quite easily gone to her old department, DCMS, and said, look... That's
the Culture and Sports Department in London.
She was the Secretary of State before she came here. She could have gone to that department and said, look, we're on a time thing here. Can we get this so that we can say to the Commonwealth Games, we'll underwrite it. It's 4 years away. All sorts of things can happen in the meantime in terms of Northern Ireland. I think it is absolutely shameful, and I think we want to see that report. It's been paid for by public money.
This is the business case,
yes,
which was rejected.
The business case. Let's have it out in the open. There's been no transparency, and the departments in Northern Ireland have all worked as little silos, and it is quite outrageous. And I just hope that it's just a pity that this level of campaigning on it now hadn't come a few weeks ago, when we might still have had some time to change. So you're saying that Karen Bradley hasn't been imaginative enough in her approach to this? No, and I think her response today was really quite pathetic. She's known about this. It's been raised numerous times over the last month or two. All the politicians have been very supportive. I think all the political parties, even as I understand Sinn Féin, weren't going to oppose it. So it could have happened. And if you can't get something like this, which would have been so good, not just for the young people in the sport, but for the for showcasing Northern Ireland. And the Permanent Secretary, who I happened to speak to today about this, said to me, "Oh, but Northern Ireland is still open for business. We want people to know that it's open for business." Well, it's not open for the kind of development of sport that could have happened with this small amount of money, and I'm really very angry about it. Are you surprised, given the power that the DUP has over at Westminster, that the DUP didn't use more influence on the government? I think in the 2016 DUP manifesto, they actually mentioned the Commonwealth Youth Games and say that could be a jumping off point, if you like, for a bid for the whole Commonwealth Games in the future. Surely, given what they've negotiated previously with the government, this could have been taken into account. Well, I think all the political parties have put pressure on, and I think Nigel Dodds has raised it, certainly in my knowledge, at least 3 or 4 times in the Commons. But, in the end, we've run out of time. Now, the Commonwealth Games Federation today has opened the bids again. I know Cardiff's very interested, and they'll probably walk in now and get this. But we could apply again. We could actually go in there. They've left the door open. I think it would be very difficult. But we could, if there was the right will, and if the Prime Minister herself actually got involved with this, to say this small amount of money. Birmingham, who are going to have the Commonwealth Games the year after, are getting a substantial amount of money. So this could be sorted, and I hope that people in Northern Ireland, particularly across the sports, will actually still campaign on this and try and see if we can reverse this decision. And so far as the officials are concerned, you've heard Stephen Grimason explaining some of the sort of difficulties in terms of value for money. Are they not between a rock and a hard place here, because they've been left in this situation where the courts are overturning their decision-making powers, and where they've got no political cover for anything? And in my view, the time is really right for no formal direct rule. It is just not good enough to have a situation where you have something. I think this is a very good example of where everything's going wrong now, because if we can't get a decision like this sorted, what about all the other decisions? And I think that, I personally think that the government is not wanting to come in to have direct rule because they don't want to upset the Irish government, and they don't want to upset Sinn Féin. And, the time is running out on this. We can't go on. Northern Ireland can't be left in this kind of vacuum and limbo situation. But over in Westminster, do you detect any appetite on the part of the government for doing that? Because isn't this just another example that they're simply going to let things slide? Well, I think that Karen Bradley's been put in there to do as the government bids on this, and they don't want to bring back direct rule. But it is getting to the stage now where any rational, sensible person will say this can't go on, and I think it has to happen, and it has to happen soon. And of course, just finally, a different subject, you're known as an ardent Brexiteer, one of the Labour MPs who rebelled against your own front bench. Yes, and we've got the withdrawal bill now in it's now law, so that's a great step forward. Recent statements from Airbus about potentially having to move their sites, which could have a knock-on effect on the aerospace sector here in Northern Ireland. Does that give you pause for thought? No, it doesn't, because I've heard all this before, and I'm quite satisfied that when, as they say, I don't know, it's a Northern Ireland expression, push comes to shove, it won't happen. OK, Kate Hoey, thanks very much. So, what do you make of that, Stephen Grimason? You convinced that for the sporting, if you like, ambassadorial reasons that Kate Hoey has set forth, that there should be a rethink about this? And indeed, is there the flexibility in the governmental system, be it across the border in London or here, to rethink this?
This is a dawdle if somebody wants to do it. Because here's the thing, and I'm not making a case against what I've already said. The DUP are in partnership with the government, and there's £1 billion sloshing around the Treasury waiting to come here. If the DUP decided tomorrow that they wanted 2 million of that to go to this, that's what would happen. This requires a political decision. There you go. But if you think this is bad, wait till you see what's going to happen on infrastructure and various other issues around the health service. This is a growing problem, and this business of being slightly pregnant, not quite direct rule, not an executive, it's becoming a joke. And yes, while there is, I agree that with Kate when she says that this is about not wanting to offend the Irish and Sinn Féin to some extent, but a greater factor in this, I think, is the fact that the whole Brexit thing is sucking the lifeblood out of the government, which doesn't entirely know what it wants to do, and it just doesn't want to be fighting too many wars on too many fronts.
I think that there was a previous issue with the Rugby World Cup bid where there was a certain amount of flexibility shown by the previous head of the civil service, Sir Malcolm McKibben, but obviously this court judgment, which questioned the decision-making power of civil servants, that's really put handcuffs on the senior officials, hasn't it?
It has in one way, but not in another. The reason I think why that was done was because the civil service expected devolution to be back quite quickly, and they were putting that down as a marker to get back to business as usual. I never thought there was a real prospect of that happening, but ultimately that's why I think it was done. I think they thought government's coming back, we need to send a signal, and that's why they did that. And then ultimately it didn't happen.
Felicity Huston, we heard Kate Hoey there saying, look, it's time to get on and go for direct rule, but there have been various occasions on which that argument has been made over the last few months, and the government seems willing just to put things off and put things off again. You
do wonder just how bad it will get before finally Westminster steps in. I mean, this is a small thing in the great scheme of things. As Stephen was saying, it has a terrible impact on those who are directly affected. But, you know, we are getting to the stage of where it is irresponsible of Westminster to leave us the way we are. You know, and
they do say, oh, we're mindful of our responsibility to good governance.
They don't show much sign of it, do they? I mean, what are they doing? The Secretary of State is, you know, on the verge of taking a stand all day long. She won't even do anything about MLA's pay, which would be something where at least people would see an example of the government maybe being on the side of the population rather than the politicians.
It could be redirected towards the young sports people.
Exactly,
possibly.
There's somewhere it could have gone. But, you know, I mean, what is going to happen soon with our hospitals? You know, there are schools where, the Oma campus, where there's nothing is happening there with those schools that should all have been built by now. And it just goes on and on and on. And at some point something awful will happen, and then they will be turned around and said, well, you know, you're the worst sort of colonial government. You just left them to sink into an abyss, and it has to stop.
Stephen Grimason, at the start of the programme, I actually made a reference to the other sports and politics story around, which is will she, won't she, will Arlene go to the Fermanagh GAA final? What do you think, and what do you make of the recent charm offensive?
Well, I think it's her call, but you can't walk people down this aisle, say that that's possibly going to happen and then not do it. All I will say is that there's so much to do in terms of rebuilding and reshaping what the DUP is about and what its leader's about in terms of, a First Minister for everyone here. This is the first step on a much longer journey.
And Felicity Huston, what do you make of the charm offensive we've seen in the last few days?
Well, I think it's a great sign. She seemed to have a great time at the Muslim Cultural Centre, getting her hands henned. I was quite envious of that. And I mean, I think it is, people... I have never really met Arlene, only very briefly. I think she is stereotyped. I think there is another Arlene in there. And maybe now that she's got a bit more freedom because she isn't in the Assembly and doing things, maybe the real Arlene will finally come out and we'll see a very different person.
I suppose the difficulty will be whether anybody remembers this when we have more hearings on the RHI inquiry due to come in the autumn.
That's the other Arlene we can look forward to seeing, yes.
Again, same point, Stephen, just briefly, that could put all of these more recent charm offensives into perspective.
This will be seen as a diversion compared to that.
OK, there we must leave it. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on Inside Politics. The programme was presented by me, Mark Devenport, and produced by Grania Dini. Our thanks to our guests, Kate Hoey, Kieran Kearney, Stephen Grimason and Felicity Huston. And we were also hearing there from Michael Conlon.